Okay, so we've already been the compulsory few minutes to let people join, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. It's my great pleasure to welcome today Rose-Anne Devlin and Fabian Lange. If you're not familiar with them, Rose-Anne is currently a professor in the Department of Economics at Carleton, right? Or Ottawa?
Ottawa.
Carleton.
Oh,
Ottawa,
big
okay.
mistake. Oh, big mistake, Frank.
Sorry. Former department chair and former vice dean of research for the Faculty of Social Science. Her research centers on applying empirical methodologies to address public policy concerns. And Rose-Anne has published extensively on health issues and in the charitable sector. Fabian Lange completed his PhD at the University of Chicago in 2004 and subsequently joined the Department of Economics at Yale in 2012. He joined the Department of Economics at McGill, where he is now. Where he holds the CRC in Labor and Personnel Economics. In 2016, the Canadian Economics Association awarded him the John Ray Prize for Research Excellence. Professor Lange is currently co-editor for Jolly, Journal of Labor Economics. And before we get started, I'm going to do a brief land acknowledgement. And Jiki Chen, our managing editor for the CJE, who is currently managing editor at large, has recorded a video message for us to hear. You'd be interested little tidbit about open access publishing there at the end of that. So McMaster University is the host institution for the Canadian Research Data Centre Network. The university is located on the traditional territory of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. We'll begin our session today by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. You can visit Native Lands Digital, a space where people can learn more about the lands they inhabit, the history of these lands, and how to actively be part of a better future going forwards together. And without further ado, we will share Ziki's message. Share sound.
Hello. On behalf of the Canadian Journal of Economics, I would like to welcome you to the fourth installment of the CRDCN CJE webinar series. As the Journal of the Canadian Economics Association, the CJE is home to many high-quality research papers that make use of Canadian data through the CRDCN. Today's seminar will showcase two of these papers. In addition, I would like to use this opportunity to remind everyone that the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, the CRKN, has an agreement with the CJE's publisher that removes the article processing charges for authors at participating CRKN institutions. That means authors from Canadian universities can publish their papers in the CJE as open access for free. I hope that will give you another reason for submitting your next paper to the CJE. Thank you.
We'll forgive him for the pacing since it was all pre-recorded. I don't know that we decided on an order for today. Does that do it? Either of you want to volunteer to go first? Otherwise, I'll just pick. Okay. Take it away, Fabian.
Okay, so I'm going to open my slides. One second. And then I'm going to share my screen. And Grant, how much time do I have again?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. All right, so this is a joint work with Stephen Jones, with Greg Riddell, and with Casey Warman. We are kind of covering most of Canada in our collaboration here. And it is by now a little bit of an economic history paper. We wrote this paper during the COVID pandemic, towards the end of the COVID pandemic. It was published now, and it describes the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Canada's labor market. It's very much a facts-based paper. So what I want to do is I want to just, in a few figures, document 6 facts about the COVID pandemic. The first one is the very short and sharp impact of the pandemic on employment and unemployment statistics. The second one is that how dominant temporary separations from employment were in the experience early during the pandemic. So from March to, let's say, June, July 2020. Subsequent to that early phase, during which temporary employment separations were dominant, we observed a shift towards surge unemployment. And in the second half of 2020, quarter four 2020 and 2021, surge unemployment was actually dominant in the statistics. But at that same point, labor demand, as proxied by job openings or vacancies, rebounded to very high levels. We also saw during this period a phase of occupational skill upgrading. That is, employment shifted towards occupations that are associated with higher interpersonal and quantitative skills and away from more physically oriented occupations. And then finally, contrary to what was reported at times quite prominently, a little bit of a meme, maybe even, our statistics, we find it very hard to find evidence of what's been called a she-session. So let's just go through these 6 facts. The way that we are reporting, what we are basing these on is the public use microdata from the LFS, and then from the confidential LFS data to look at transitions that allows us to look at the panel and also gives us more detailed occupation information. For job openings and vacancies, we are relying on the job vacancy and wage survey, as well as data from Lightcast, that's formerly known as Burning Glass Technology. That is a private sector company that has been web scraping job openings for a number of years now. All right, fact one, the employment statistics, the unemployment and the employment statistics display a very short and sharp increase in unemployment and decrease in employment during the early phase of the pandemic. So this graph here, I'm going to use a very similar structure. And each of these lines refers to a different year, except for the yellow line, which gives us our baseline, which is the 5 years prior to the pandemic. So in this way, we are not seasonally adjusting, but we are letting you visually do that on your own by comparing the periods in question to this pre-period and the seasonal patterns within that period. And what you can see here is that as of March, April 2020, the unemployment rate in Canada really rose very rapidly, more than doubled, up to about 14% in late spring 2020, but it then recovered at a fairly similar clip, a fairly rapid clip throughout the summer of 2020. By 2021, our paper goes only till the end of that green line. I have updated the statistics just to make it a little less economic history here. And so by the end of 2021, that's the green line, unemployment has really gone back to the pre-period levels. And in 2022, as well as in 2023, we still observe very low unemployment rates. Right? So they are slightly drifting up. Our last observation here is October 2023, the end of that burgundy line there. The same patterns in the unemployment rate are mirrored in the employment rate itself. So this is the employment to population rate here. And just as what I've just showed you before, we observed this very rapid decline in employment early on, with a almost as rapid, somewhat slower increase in employment and a complete recovery by the end of 2021. In that time period where unemployment increased dramatically, that increase is dominated by temporary separations. So these are individuals who report that they expect being rehired by their former employers, and that share in the population grew by 4.5 percentage points in the first 2 months. That increase in 4.5 percentage points, though, understates how important temporary separations from employment were, because they also saw this should be we also saw similar separations in other relationships. So we saw individuals who are reporting to still be employed, they're reporting that they're still employed, but they are now absent from work early during the pandemic. And that is a very large fraction of the population. That increased from about 4 percentage points to about 11 percentage points in April 2020. Right? But again, as before, you see very rapid declines in the share of the population for which this applies, absent, except for, of course, the seasonal pattern during the summer months that is present in the data always. We also see this large increase in marginally attached, so individuals who are not currently searching for a job but want to work. And when we look at the panel data from the confidential panel data, we will observe that many of those individuals in all of these categories return to the same industry, occupation, firm size cells as observed prior to the separation, indicating to us that a lot of these individuals are in fact temporarily separated, likely returning to their old employers. Here is the type of graph that we have in the paper, right? That graph shows the 3 unemployment categories. You can basically ignore the green lines at the bottom of the graph, that those are future starts, individuals who are reporting they're unemployed but have a job lined up. The blue, right, the blue spike up in unemployment that you see in the solid line, those are the temporary layoffs. But as of summer 2020, that was receding. That solid blue line is for the solid lines here are for 2020. And it was increasingly replaced by search unemployment, so individuals who are looking for new jobs, new employment relationships, as shown in the red line. Okay, so that basically is the third fact, that is after mid-2020, we are not in the phase of the pandemic anymore where temporary separations from existing employment relationships, but most of unemployment at least is now search unemployment. All right, so what is driving this increase in search unemployment? Well, first, temporary layoff is receding very rapidly because they are returning at very high rates to their former employers, what we think are their former employers. And that depletes the stock of what I like to call the waiting workforce, the workforce that is just waiting to return to their former employers. But there's also some leakage from temporary layoff and marginally attached to the search group. Right? And that leakage is behind most of the increase in the stock of search unemployed. These search unemployed are that's the one side of the labor market, of the search labor market, but the other side of the labor market is recruiting activities. And here, as I said before, we are relying on 3 proxies: the Lightcast, the Burning Glass Technologies data, as well as the data from the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey. We need the Burning Glass Technologies data because, unfortunately, right through the pandemic, the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey was not collecting data. So we are lacking crucial data there for these from January 2020 to, actually from Q1 2020 to Q3 2020. Right? What I'm showing you therefore here is both job vacancies as measured by Burning Glass Technology, as well as the quarterly and monthly series from the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey. And interestingly, by the time the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey starts collecting data again, that's in October 2020, you observe, or the fourth quarter of 2020, you observe that job openings were at higher rates even than in the pre-pandemic. So there's been a rapid, sharp decline in job openings in the early months of the pandemic, as seen in the Burning Glass Technology data, and then a rebound throughout the second half of 2020, and then going into very high running rates of job openings during 2021. This here is essentially the job vacancy and wage survey with a little bit longer perspective, again, updating it to the most recently available data. The broken red line is the monthly data. And you can see how strong the labor market, how strong labor demand was all through 2022, and even most of 2023 are still 2023. Vacancies are declining somewhat, or reported job openings are declining somewhat, but they're still running at very high historical levels. And you should keep in mind that this period prior to the pandemic is actually a period of unusually strong labor demand to start off with. Right? So even though we see now a decline in job openings, we are coming really from unusually high levels. So the labor demand as proxied by job openings can only be described as still very strong. Okay, what's this fifth fact that I wanted to refer to is this shift to quantitative and interpersonal occupations. And so here we use the occupation distribution in the LFS. We characterize them using ONET data by to the extent that they use quantitative skills, interpersonal skills, and require physical strength. Right? And what you can see during the pandemic is a shift towards those type of occupations that are relying more on interpersonal and quantitative skills, right, or requirements, and away from these physical strength type occupations. I have not updated this graph to the most recent data, and I would in fact be quite curious to see to what extent that shift has persisted or whether we have returned to the pre-pandemic in terms of these measures as well. The final fact that I want to talk about is this notion that there was a she-cession here. And so I'm showing you here the unemployment rate for males and females on the left, males on the right, to give you evidence for why I emphasize that I don't see much evidence for this so-called she-cession, right? So at first glance, you see that the unemployment rate among women remained elevated all through the summer of 2020, whereas it declined much more rapidly among males. But that increase that in unemployment rate through the summer of 2020 on the women's side, in fact, is driven by what I think are seasonal factors. And you can see that by comparing to the 2015-2019 period. So seasonal unemployment is just a much more prevalent phenomenon for women than it is for men. And it makes it seem in these unemployment rate statistics as if the recovery was not proceeding for women in this time period. The labor market recovery was not proceeding at the same pace as for men. Once you actually take that out, you will observe that both among men and among women, unemployment rates were declining at fairly similar rates. And the similar patterns can be seen in other statistics for which I don't have prepared slides for today. So just to repeat the 6 things that I've just teased you here with a few slides, the first is this impact on employment, that unemployment was very short and sharp, right? But we returned to pre-pandemic labor market conditions fairly rapidly, more rapidly than was predicted by almost any pundit in that early part of the recession. The dominant fact for understanding the COVID pandemic is that temporary employment made up the majority of separations in this early phase of the pandemic. Whereas in the second half of 2020, 2021, surge unemployment started to become much more important, but the stock of surge unemployment rose significantly, but not to levels seen in serious recessions, normal type of recessions. Why did it not rise so far? Because labor demand rebounded to very high levels shortly after the initial phase of the pandemic. And then throughout 2021, 2022, labor demand proxied by job openings or vacancies was very high. And you see that also in job finding rates of the unemployed. Those actually returned to very solid, healthy levels quite early on in the pandemic, bounding the increase in search unemployment. I showed you some evidence on occupational skill upgrading, and finally that there was no, what I don't think, at least first order evidence for this so-called she-cession. These 6 facts here we document from using the Canadian data. I also want to emphasize that essentially the same patterns are observable in the US data as well. So if you take equivalent or analogous data from the US, you will find most of these findings confirmed in that data as well, after adjusting your measurements for differences between the two countries. And that is about 20 minutes, and I'm going to return my time to the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fabian. We have the Q&A box. Similarly, if I think you can raise your hand as an audience member. We're only about 20 people today, so I'm happy to kind of unmute mics and let this be more of a discussion. We'll take a few minutes for questions from Fabian before we move on to Rose-Anne from University of Ottawa. In case anyone's getting warmed up, Fabian, can you comment on which sectors maybe, like, you alluded to having done some analysis by sectors. Which sectors was there more sort of recall, and which sectors moved more into search, if there's a difference?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is that there were the low-wage sectors that were initially the most heavily affected and so this is food, accommodation, some retail, right? So really public-facing service sectors with a lot of interpersonal contact for obvious reasons, and a lot of those were actually affected by shutdowns repeatedly throughout 2020, even 2021. And one of the curious phenomena that I think, well, curious, maybe it's curious to everybody except the labor economist, curious to nobody except the labor economist, but people don't seem to have returned to their old jobs. They have, a lot of these individuals seem to have transitioned to other employment and remain in other industries. At least that's the last reading that I had on the data, which is now a little bit dated as well. So we have seen like a persistent shrinking of employment in those sectors, lasting through 2020, 2021. And then we have seen a little bit, of excess retirement in some higher paying professions, possibly drawing individuals away from the lower paying professions as well. So I think it's those sectors, food, accommodation, retail, that have seen people who were leaving their employment more permanently, were then switching to more highly paid professions, maybe with better conditions, with less pandemic risk, and are not returning to them. And so a lot of these shortages that we have seen, when you walked around cities for a while, you saw like help wanted signs everywhere. Most positions for a new restaurant get filled by other people who are working for other restaurants already. So if those people have left the industry, you will have labor shortages, less of a pool. Yeah.
Okay. And there's a question from Gillian Petit. With the she-cession analysis, did you look at unemployment rates for women versus men, and then by with and without children at home?
Yeah, we did. I don't recall the detail, like the details in precisely. My recollection is that yes, for women with children, in especially young children, like primary school age children, right, there's a little bit more of a tendency to stay at home, to not go back to your employment. It gets the data, if you do it on a monthly level and you cut it finely, it gets hard to say like too much confidently about subgroups. but that is a little bit to be expected by the nature of the pandemic. If you remember those times when we had to teach our children ourselves. So, and you see a little bit, in that population, you do see some impact, if I recall that correctly. It's just that population makes up a relatively small fraction of the overall working female population. But it's not tiny. It's clearly an important part of the population, but it's not enough to really move the aggregate statistics.
All right, thank you very much. So now it's Rose-Anne's turn. If anyone thinks of any questions, we'll probably have a little time at the end if there's anything else we want to ask Fabian. But for now, we'll turn it over to Rose-Anne.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to revisit this paper. It seems like ages since we worked on it, and it's been a lot of fun to reread it and think a little bit about it. So this is very cleverly entitled "Build It and They Will Come," and it's about the impact of proximity to potential volunteer organizations on the decision, basically on the decision to volunteer. The paper is joint with Catherine Jerry Armstrong, one of my colleagues, and it is based on work that Farouj Sethi did for her PhD thesis, and Catherine and I supervised. So, you know, but as I said, it's been a lot of fun to look at this. If you look at the decision to volunteer, there's quite a large literature on the decision to volunteer, and it's been linked to a wide variety of economic and non-economic returns. And, you know, and over many years, I've dabbled with that literature myself. And so Kathleen Day and I, many years ago, 1998, Canadian Journal, published some work on looking at the link between earnings and volunteering, and found pretty strong evidence that volunteers, you know, the fact that one volunteered had an impact on the earnings. So, you know, looking at that whole question. But there's been a lot of information, a lot of literature on various aspects of volunteering. The civic engagement, people who volunteer are more civically engaged. That may not come as any surprise. Even health and happiness, Farouj and Catherine and I have a paper that looks and has pretty careful causal relationship between the volunteering and happiness. So that's kind of fun. And of course, as you probably know, many schools across the US and in Canada, school boards mandate some kind of some mandatory volunteering for school children or students. In Ontario, for instance, high school students have to do 40 hours of some sort of volunteering or social engagement in order to graduate. So, you know, you could question whether mandating volunteering is a useful thing, but in any event, we think it is, and so we do it. Just some stats: about 40% of individuals in Canada volunteer at least 1 hour. And we know that, so there's things that we know about volunteering. It's affected by education and income, religiosity, age, marital status, children, and a whole host of characteristics. So we understand that quite well. Now, recently, there's been a literature, well, not that recent, but people have started to look at some of the physical characteristics of neighborhoods and whether those had an influence on whether an individual is volunteered. So things like whether the neighborhood is walkable, access to libraries and cultural centers and things like that. So there is a literature there. And then another neighborhood characteristic is the physical access to volunteer opportunities. And there's been a couple of papers that have started to look at that question. Both of them are papers that look at the correlation between some aggregate statistic on the number of voluntary opportunities and where individuals live. So for instance, Rotolo and Wilson, they look at nonprofit organizations per 1,000 at a state level. And Moen and Bennett, and they've got a few papers, they look at it, this is in the UK, and they look at it at a county level. And they again do a count of the number of volunteer opportunities at the county level and whether that affects volunteering. So what our paper does is it builds on this, and it builds on this literature in two ways. One, we use a very small geographic unit, the 6-digit postal code, the smallest possible geographic unit, actually, that's available to look at individuals in that unit and volunteer opportunities in that unit. And we also try and push on causality. So rather than just look at whether there's a correlation between the presence or the proximity of volunteer opportunities, we try to really hammer out a causal story. We're convinced by it. I don't know if everybody else is, but we're definitely convinced by this causal story. So let's turn to the data. So one of the reasons why we can do this, of course, is because technology has changed so much over the last couple of decades, and in particular over the last decade or so with this geolinking. And so we are able to look at the location of charities with a 6-digit postal code, and those data are from the T3010 charitable returns. And then we look at the location of individuals. We'll talk about that in a second. But the T3010 charitable returns data set, this is administrative data from the CRA. It's available to anybody. You just ask. And what you get is basically a copy of the returns that all charities, all registered charities in Canada must file annually. There's about 80,000 plus charities at any given year. And this information set is actually a really rich idea. It's that you need to play around with, that you need to clean it up a bit. It's, there's some problems, but it's really quite good. And CRA has made a point of trying to make it as research ready as possible, even though it's not designed for researchers per se. It's really an administrative data set. So it will come of no surprises that most of these charities are located in 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, BC, and Alberta, where the most of the population is. And just a little breakdown of the types of charities, because we know that as well. About 39% of the sample is religious, social welfare comes in a distant second, 21% education, culture, and art. So that gives you a little idea of what we're talking about here. The big challenge on the paper was trying to get information on where individuals were located. There used to be a really fantastic survey, the Canadian Survey of Giving, Volunteering, and Participating, and I've used it many times. But that survey didn't have information on individuals' postal codes. And we really needed to get information on individuals' postal codes in order to do the matching up with the location of the registered charities. But the GSS has sort of taken over from the CSGVP survey in recent years. And we, at the time when we started doing the project quite a while ago, we had access to 4 cycles of the GSS that had information both on the postal codes of individuals, which is kind of standard with the confidential files of the GSS, but it's not standard to get information on volunteering, and we needed to get information on volunteering. So that's why we zeroed in on those 4. And of course, we used the postal code conversion file to get the coordinates of where individuals were located based on their postal code. And then we did a count of their details in the paper, but we basically counted how many registered charities, data set suitably cleaned up, how many registered charities there were around these coordinates of an individual: 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers. And that was our measure of access. So let's just turn to a couple of observations regarding volunteers and non-volunteers in samples. Some of you might be curious about that. Let me just point out a couple of things. And these are not all the variables we use. We use a lot more, but these were all the variables I could put in one page. So, you know, you might not be surprised to learn that women tend to volunteer a little more than men. Volunteers tend to be married or common law in relationship relative to non-volunteers. You can see that volunteers tend to have a university degree. What else is interesting? They tend to be of higher income than non-volunteers. There's a whole bunch of things here. They tend to be more religious. And I just went down to the bottom here, and you can see that if we looked at the number of organizations, the average number of organizations within a 5-kilometer buffer of an individual's place of residence, it looks on the face of it like they're more around non-volunteers and volunteers, but you'll see that actually, you know, once we start controlling for things, this changes quite a bit. But we see a substantial variation in access to charities in our data set. So for instance, about 23% of individuals have no charitable organizations within a 1-kilometer radius. 1% has no located within a 5-kilometer radius, although this matters a lot whether you're talking about urban centers and rural postal codes, and you'll see that over 60% of our sample has between 1 and 20 charities within 1 kilometer. So you get the point. There's lots and lots of variations. And of course, the distribution really does vary quite dramatically between those living in urban and rural settings. And I'll come back to that because it does have implications. So we can see also some variation access by population quintile. So we calculated the population by postal code for people who volunteer and non-volunteer, and then we looked at the numbers. And what's kind of interesting, marginally interesting maybe, is that, you know, when you look at the least populated quintile, the volunteer and non-volunteer kind of looks the same. Once you get to the higher population, you start to see a bit more with where the volunteers are located versus the non-volunteers. But again, these are just kind of some numbers. So let's look at how we've tried to identify the impact of access to volunteer organizations. So here's just the basic PROBIT, basically latent model, and we do deal with endogeneity, but this is the standard setup. The variable A is access, and we put in square because we think the access has a nonlinear relationship, and indeed it does. Although, quite honestly, the quadratic term has a really small impact, so it's it's close to linear. But in any event, that's the basic model. But of course, individuals may be predisposed to. Individuals who are predisposed to volunteering may in fact choose their location in order to be close to some volunteer opportunities. And of course, similarly, volunteer organizations may not locate randomly. So this is the endogeneity problem that we struggle with. And so how do we deal with it? Well, we deal with it using an IV, which of course was in favor for a long time. It's kind of out of favor a little bit now, but I think, the big trick here is to try and find an instrument that is sufficiently correlated with the variable in question. And what we do is we use this variable, the number of charitable organizations between a 5 and 35 kilometer buffer of an individual's postal code. And the literature talks about this as being kind of a spatial lagged instrument. And the idea is that when you're deciding to go to a large center, so you've decided to move to Ottawa, I mean, who wouldn't, right? But you decided that you're moving to Ottawa, and the kind of factors that influence that decision are usually job related or education related. However, the neighborhood in which you decide to live may be influenced by neighborhood characteristics. And 35 kilometers turns out is the average land area of census metropolitan areas in Canada. So we said, let's look at the number of charities which within 5 to 35 kilometers of the individual's place of residence, and we'll use that as an instrument and square for access. We also use a control function approach, the control function is a more appropriate way of dealing with estimating problems when you have when you don't have a continuous dependent variable. And here we have a 0-1 dependent variable. It's the likelihood of the probability of volunteering. So it's a two-stage process. We're regressing access, which is actually one of 5 radius bands on the instrument and its square, plus all the other covariants. And then we use the residuals from number 1 as a control in basically the probet that I just gave you. There are a number of identifying assumptions, which we state and we discuss in the text, and basically have to hold in order for our estimates to be to be believable. Okay, so I'm not going to deal with these technical issues unless somebody brings me back to them, and then I'll be happy to. So in any event, we set up this control function, we have this instrument, and then we run the main specification, and we do a few other specifications. So let's look at our initial 4 specifications. Left-hand side variable is the decision to volunteer, yes or no. And on the right-hand side, we are looking at whether it's access 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers. So we have all of these represent a set of results that we estimated. You'll see here that I've given you, we've provided the basic probit where we don't control for endogeneity. The second column is the main instrument, and that's the instrument with the number of charities between 5 and 35 kilometers from an individual's place of residence. The third column is a 2-stage least squares estimate of the using the main instrument. We were asked to do that just in case we were doing something tricky with the control function approach, so we did that. And then we have an alternative instrument, which I'll talk about in a minute or so. But it's not the main instrument is the one I think we want to focus on. So let's have a peek, first of all, at this main instrument. And what you can see is, so remember, we're looking at, if you have access, how many registered charities within 1 kilometer of an individual's place of abode, and then the next one is within 2 kilometers, and so on. And you can see very clearly that, first of all of them are statistically significant. I'll talk about whether they're economically significant in a second, but they're all statistically significant. And you can see that the effect is much larger for organizations, charitable organizations that are closest to where the individual lives, and that effect gets smaller and smaller as you move away, which is kind of what you would expect. So if we look at just the access within 1 kilometer, we can look at what does that actually mean. So on the bottom, we've calculated the predicted probability of an individual being a volunteer, the reference individual being a volunteer for this estimation, and that is that it's 0.38. So as I said earlier, it's about 40% of the population volunteers. So this is just about right. But that's the estimated predicted probability from the reference individuals from the equation. I didn't give it for all the other ones because it's just the table is very messy. And so what this says is that predicted probability will increase by 0.0031 points if there is a registered charity within 1 kilometer of where the individual lives. And so what that amounts to, if you look at that as a percentage, that is about a 0.8, close to a 1% increase in the probability that the individual will volunteer if there is a charity within 1 kilometer of where they live. You can also see that if we run a 2-stage least squares, the story is basically the same, except for that 1 kilometer one is no longer significant. But given that we really don't think that that's the right way to estimate the model because of the dichotomous dependent variable, we'd rather stick to the other. But they're very, very similar. And then we had this other alternative instrument. Now, the alternative instrument was an instrument that we kind of were keen on initially and then realized that we shouldn't be quite as keen on. And that was one where we said, okay, if you live, if we're looking at access of up to 1 kilometer, let's look at 1 to 35 as the instrument. And if it's up to 2 kilometers, let's look at 2 to 35 as the instrument, and so on. And so the instrument is a bit different for each of these specifications. Of course, the problem is that then we are saying that for the access 1 kilometer, we have all the 1 to 35, then we are saying is exogenous. But then when we get to the 2nd kilometer, now all of a sudden it's only 2 to 35 that's exogenous anyway. So you can see that there are, there's some inconsistency in what is an exogenous IV, and so we've decided to really hang our hat on the main instrument. But we're giving these others, and the story is the same, by the way, whether we use the main instrument or this alternative instrument. And we did 3 different robustness checks for causality. So one of the things we said was, well, listen, maybe, because remember, we're trying to figure out whether do individuals actually move because they see that there are possible organizations to volunteer. And so this is just simply it's not an exogenous decision. So we said it's probably likely to be more exogenous for individuals who've been there for much longer. So if we look at individuals who've resided in their current place, the current residence for at least 10 years, then, that is a more exogenous or less endogenous decision based on what currently is going on with the registered charities in that community than those who've been there for less. And so we run the regressions for these 2 samples. So you'll see here that we've got individuals who've lived in their current neighborhood for actually at least 10 years, so it's greater than or equal to, or have lived in their neighborhood less than 10 years. And we see indeed that there is some evidence to suggest that the effect is stronger for those who've been in the community for longer. There's stories we can tell for that. But nevertheless, so we think that that's kind of supporting a causal relationship. But nevertheless, we see right across the board that the farther away the charity is, the lower the impact it has on the probability that the individual will volunteer. So the second thing we did was we estimated 5 different donut-like circles around the postal code where the radius of the hole became larger and larger. And so we looked at, how many around, so for those who lived 1 kilometer, how many are around the 1 kilometer, then around the 2 kilometers, and around the 3 kilometers. We call this a donut-like circle, that the whole of the donut got bigger and bigger and bigger. And we look to see whether that, do we get evidence, the idea being the farther away the charity is, the less likely it will have an impact on the individual's probability of volunteering. And that indeed is what we found. So you can see that now all of these results here are just probes. There's been no control for endogeneity here, because these are other exercises where we're just trying to get some, whether our instinct corroborates the causal story. And indeed, we think it does. Again, the farther away the charity, the smaller the impact is on the probability of volunteering. And finally, we said, okay, so we know that from theory tells us is that time costs matter a lot. And one of the reasons why individuals may volunteer close to where they live is because it takes them less time to get there. And we thought that by looking at people who work for full-time versus others, those who work full-time have higher, if you like, time cost. The opportunity cost of time is higher. And so do we see a difference between these 2 groups? And yes, we do. So full-time employed, the impact of being closer to these volunteer opportunities is larger than for those who are not employed. Okay. Now, there's two possible sources of measurement error in the access variable that could account for differences in the estimate between the probit, where the estimate was lower than when we did the control function estimate. So the access is constructed based on postal codes, and so we think that we know that they'll be more accurate for urban dwellers than for rural dwellers, because the way the postal codes are constructed in urban environments, postal codes can be for most individuals, they're block faces. So there's so an apartment building can have one postal code. So very, very small geographic spaces that define postal codes, whereas when you go out into rural areas, the postal codes can be quite big, and so we expect this effect to be much less accurate for those in rural areas than for those in urban areas. And that is what we found, with one exception. I'll talk about that in a second. So first of all, so we see for the urban dwellers, we get a really clear gain, gradient, higher likelihood to affect the probability of volunteering when it's close, within 1 kilometer, and it gets progressively smaller, always statistically significant. So urban clearly is where most of the action is going on. It's curious and completely consistent with our story that for rural dwellers, if they have a charity within 1 hour, within 1 kilometer of where they live, it has a big impact on their decision to volunteer. Well, when you live in rural environments, there are so few volunteer opportunities. We think that this is just makes a lot of sense. Another possible error in our variable is the fact that registered charities are not the only venue in which individuals may volunteer. So nonprofits is a much larger group than registered charities. So what we did was we got enhanced points of interest data, when your GPS, the enhanced points of interest. But we managed to get data on the location of primary schools, secondary schools, and libraries, which are really the types of organizations where we expect to observe, where we observe individuals volunteering, and we added those into our data set. And this is this last section right here. And what we find are results that are very similar to the results in our main specification. In other words, it doesn't seem, the fact that we don't have all the nonprofits, we just have registered charities, doesn't seem to make a huge difference to our results. So let's go back to the question that we asked: does proximity to charitable opportunities matter? And the answer is yes, yes, yes. Predicted probability volunteering clearly increases with the number of charitable organizations nearby. But these estimated effects are small, so does it really matter? And the answer is still yes. We think, first of all, you can think about the location of these volunteer opportunities as somewhat nudging individuals into volunteering. You walk past this place, you see some things, you see that there's food being handed out at 5 o'clock at the local church, and all of a sudden you think, oh, gee, maybe I could help out here. But also, don't forget that we're just looking at what happens if you add one more charity to the mix. What is the impact then? But there are more than one more charity typically in any given area. And so, we see, for instance, the average standard deviation is about 44 charities, and the growth of charities is somewhere between 6 and 8% annually, depending if it's rural or urban. So, the fact that one more charity has a really small impact, but, it's still there. I think, when you look at the actual numbers, and it's not going to be linear, but it's going to have a much larger impact. Anyway, so basically that's what we do. So policy implications, aside from being, of course, very interesting, there are some implications, and I think probably one of the important implications here is for urban planning. And there's been lots of talk about about developing the inner core in cities and making cities more livable and having more densely populated areas. And so we think that you could parlay our work into some implications for the importance of having things like charities downtown. I'm not saying that we have to mandate the location of charities downtown, but there are clearly benefits associated with having these sorts of venues available to individuals. So the bottom line is, when it comes to the link between charities and volunteering, location matters. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rose-Anne.
Yes.
Again, if there's any questions, hands or the question and answer panel. Rose-Anne, you have the unluckiness that I've worked with the 3010 data and the GSS data before, so my questions are going to be particularly pointed.
Fantastic.
The tax returns are only the head office.
Yes,
location.
yes. No, exactly. And yes, exactly. And so what we've done was we paid really close attention to the postal codes for things like churches and head offices. We contacted them. We asked where they were located. We eliminated some organizations where it was clear that it wasn't terribly meaningful in terms of where they were located. We ran everything, taking out all religious organizations, because sometimes they're the ones where you get I don't know, the Church of Latter-day Saints. There's one head office somewhere out west, and they're all over the place. So we did actually a lot of cleaning up with the data. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And then with the VD module and the volunteering detail module and the GSS, did you you literally say where did you, the question is where did you volunteer, or organization volunteer number 1, 2, and 3? That is dirty, but people give you that information, and then you have that from the tax return also. Did you make any attempt to figure out whether people are volunteering close to home? Is it like a salience of being close to charities that you volunteer somewhere you want to and maybe you drive, or is it I specifically volunteer at this place because it's close to where I live?
You don't know from the GSS where they volunteer. You know what types of organizations. They will list sometimes the types of organizations, but you don't know where they are. So there's nothing from that survey that allows you to link it up. So it's literally through the 6-digit postal code.
Okay. Maybe it's just the newer GSSs that ask for the name of the organization, or maybe it's not in the RDC data. I'm not sure.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't seen it but if they have, that would be fantastic. But not.
I'm pretty sure, for sure, 2023. It's in the questionnaire, but whether that means it follows through.
It is in the questionnaire. It's always been in the questionnaire,
okay.
But it's never. It has been really hard to get the data. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, audience, I've given you enough time to think of questions. Anything for Rose-Anne? Then I think all that remains is to thank our presenters for today. And we'll see you next time. See you next year.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Some virtual applause is coming through.
Yes.